right, thank you very much, Deborah, for your presentation. Thank you very much to the three of you. And if you wish, we will now start the debate. One of the things that gives me joy is that there's lots of colleagues here who are involved with this idea of archive and archive materiality in many ways. So I hope lots of you had lots of questions and comments to make. But given the fact that I am the moderator, I will make the most of that privilege. I'll start by making a comment firsthand because I find it relevant. There's lots of ideas circulating in my head at the moment, but there's something I find interesting about the presentations we've heard today, not only the ones in the afternoon, but also the ones in the morning. And this is a certain will, quite intense will, of the relationship with the archive. It is not a distant or scientific relationship, but it's quite personal involvement there in the way of understanding the work with archive. And in this sense, I was remembering this morning something I read recently in the presentation of the catalog of an exhibition that was in Reina Sofia not too long ago, and it was the graphical turn. I don't know whether you've heard about it. And the curators of it was curated by a fairly large group of researchers, and they started presenting the project by explaining and saying what they understand by turn. This is interesting because we have talked about the archival turn quite a lot throughout the day, and they say that they would like to understand turn, and I quote, not as much as a deviation or change in itinerary, but rather as a revolt and as a challenge to power and as investment in legacy. And I believe it is interesting to bring this idea of turn to the archival turn that we use constantly, in terms that there's a lot or large will of challenging the power represented by archive in many different ways, and to think about the idea of having it in a different way, or maybe having some deviations from it in order to work in different ways. So I would like to start by asking the first question to Deborah, and then I would ask questions to the three of you if you wish. But I would like, well, this morning, Jorge mentioned the fact that there's lots of exhibitions, archive exhibitions, but not as many where archive is shown, or where the goal of the exhibition is to show the archive. We have seen some fragments. Well, the main reason we thought it was important to have the Biennale of Venice here is the exhibition that goes through the history of the over 100 years of the institution, if I understood correctly. And I would like to know about the curatorial team, what was and I assume this was an exhibition that wanted to show the history of the Biennale and not as much the history of the archive. But I would like to know to what extent you were aware that you were also showing the structure of the archive by developing this exhibition.
In this way, it was an interesting experience because, the artistic directors try to explore a theme focusing on the history of Biennale. Of course, it was very difficult. It is very difficult to represent the history because the history is very complex. So they managed to find a key for the study, and they focus on the principal changement, geopolitical changement, and the way that the institution, the Biennale, reacted to these changes and in some way promoted the changes. And this was the theme. So they say, okay, each director has a specific professionality on his specific field. And so each one explore the specific activities, then they come together and try to develop the exhibition, the show. But they were coordinated, of course, by Cecilia Lemani, who was the art director. He was more used to arts, to the shows, to exhibitions. But and they have to work with the staff of the archive, because they knew the material, the holdings, but they even not were used to work with those materials. And so it was, we share the experience. It was very difficult because it was COVID time. And so we were in Venice, they were in, one in Berlin, one in the USA, and they selected and they discovered the material. Yes, I know that it's a way of showing the archive, but I think that this is one of the key pillars of the Biennale. That is the autonomy of each director, of each artistic director, that is free to imagine its own activities, their own projects, and the staff, the organization that offers the professionality and all it's necessary to develop the project. And so in the archive they meet each other. Us with our professionality, my colleagues, especially my colleagues that they are archivists, that are very competent on the field of the research on archive, and at disposal to their artistic vision and project.
Okay. Well, thank you. Para continuar.
So, to continue, I would like to talk about the fact that I have three people here with me that approach archives from three different perspectives. You are the institution, or the institutional perspective, Catarina, artist, and Beatriz, the academic researcher working with archive and on the archive as a topic, but from the outside, I understand. So, this may not be as related with exhibiting the archive, but on the other hand, I do believe so. In the preparation conversation that I had with Caterina in order to talk about this, I heard a concept that was very interesting. At some point, Caterina said, well, I work with research in the archive, but I am also interested in the experience of research. And this is something I find highly interesting, especially when we talk about the way in which archive and the exhibition reflect themselves as the poles of tension. Obviously, the experience in exhibitions is very different to that of the research in the archive, but having been responsible of an institutional archive and having worked subsequently as an external researcher that goes as a user, I see that sometimes we do not pay enough attention to this because, well, Eric said this morning that knowledge is not there or is not found, it's just constructed and built. So the experience of the archive is basically part of that creation of knowledge. So could you maybe elaborate further about the different aspects of this you are interested in? Maybe Katerina can start. I remember this conversation and talking about the experience of the research experience. And I believe that this project that I just presented, that's basically why I talked about that, because it is very clear when you wonder at the end of it all, what do I feel? I am in the middle of it all. I need to decide what to do, what to confirm, what not to do. And that is how I feel. So this information that you get when you're reflecting oftentimes is part of an analysis by which you are aware that many of the things you decide are not in your consciousness. It's like unconscious, especially when you're working at that level with problematic matters or with things that have the capacity to stress people and who make me nervous as well. And sometimes I don't even know why. I think that we need to continue working on the problem, But we need to take into account that many of the things that we mention, and today, this very morning, we spoke about scientific aspects of archives and subjective aspects of it all. But there's another part, which is the unconscious part. So why we decide this and not that? Yes. Okay. Beatrice?
Very interesting question as to experience, because I think we come not only from outside or inside of archives, but we have a very different relation of the archive to the exhibition. I mean, you are archiving exhibitions, you exhibit an archive, and I talk about that relation. but I'm interested really in how the curatorial can become a research experience as well. How can you actually put something into the public realm, and through that movement you create a new kind of knowledge through this new constellation. So it turns into a very physical experience, and I think in your work that became obvious. And when you just talked, I thought about the, for example, the two ways in which an artist, Dominic González Förster, and an archive dealt with the history of the Skulpturprojekt in Münster. I don't know whether you have seen that or heard about it. In simultaneously at the same, I think it was 2007, at the same Skulpturprojekt, there was an archival show on on the history of the Skulpturprojekt that started in 77, and they took out all the models for the sculptures that were put into the open. But by exhibiting the models, what they did was altering the specific characteristics of large-scale sculpture and turning them into tiny little things that started having a very different agency in relation to one another. And at the same time, parallel to that, Dominic González Förster on purpose minimized, through the history of that sculpture project, some of the whatever signature sculptures, and put them on display within an open field, an open area in Münster as her installational work, and talked simultaneously about history and archiving, as well as about the previous ideas that were connected with those sculptures, but kind of made defunctional, because nothing happened anymore in relation to these minimized objects. I'm saying that because I think in both cases, the fact that you exhibit that again created an experience that created in itself some new meaning, some new knowledge about the preconditions in which the exhibition took place in the first place, but also about the potential of re-looking at it through kind of archival practices.
You want to say?
Yes, I think that it's a completely different point of view. In the case of the Biennale Archive, we have to deal with the departments, and so we are at disposal of the departments. But starting from that, we are at disposal of all the researchers. Our way of exposing the archive is sharing the materials with the researching and say, okay, we are here, so let's develop research from us, leaving everyone free to find the right way to study or to exhibit, to develop an artistic project. but this is in the nature of La Biennale. It's our specific skill because as I said, we have the principle that the artistic projects are autonomous, and we have to be a give the professionality to be to help them, and then yes, also develop specific research. As I said, we act more with the colleges, for instance. It's one field that in which we develop specific and autonomous from the point of view of the archive, much more than exhibition, for instance.
Gracias. Me parece interesante.
Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting, the idea of becoming nervous, especially when it's the institution getting nervous. We have all experienced both sides of it, the part of the consulting part and the part that has the institutional responsibility, and then suddenly find themselves in a situation they wouldn't like to be in. I have another question, but I would like to know whether there are any questions online or whether anyone in the audience wants to ask something. And if not, I don't think we have anything online, no. And what's about the audience? Anyone wanting to ask a question, or should I continue shooting? Okay, one over here.
About the relationship between archives and exhibitions, in what sense do art museums create a specific problem? In the sense, not all museums are art museums. There are historical museums, ethnographic museums, and those museums clearly have those other kind of museums have, in a way, the main function is to provide information about whatever, knowledge, to produce knowledge by means of an exhibition. But in art exhibitions, it happens so often that the main goal is an aesthetic experience, not. And for instance, I can illustrate that kind of conflict by the Dutch situation at the Stedelijk Museum and the director who was fired, Beatrix Roef. One of the first things she did was, usually they want to get rid of the policy of the former director. She also did that. And she displaced the main collection of the collection of the museum to the basement. And in the basement, that's usually where the storage room is. So that the basement, that's where the archive, the storage room is. No, and she put there the exhibition of the collection. But then what she did is she modeled this exhibition on the archive. It was as if you were in the storage room. And it was, for me, a big success, because by doing that, she was able to show, I think, 4 times as many artworks than usual, because usually they want to show in a kind of optimal condition, as if they're altarpieces. But no, she didn't do that. Just one artwork for each year, and they hang closely together. And of course, for all the art professionals, artists, as well as museum directors and curators, they hated it, because the artwork was not respected. It was as if you entered the storage room. But for the public, it was very successful, because for the public, the storage room is like a treasure room, and that is much more interesting than a well-designed exhibition, which is all about aesthetic experience. So, in what sense could, in a way, the art museum model itself on the archive instead of the other relating? How do we show the archive in the exhibition space? I would like to reverse the question. Is it more possible that an exhibition space or curator models that practice on the archive?
Just to say another word, because in the historical archive, it was a tradition that there were different gallery in the archives for the public to, for instance, in l'Hôtel de Soubise in Paris, during the 19th century, public enter in the reserve and to see the iron placard and to open it and to see the chart of the royaume. It's what, for instance, at the Museum in Marseille, they used to practice to invite artists in this in the not the archive but the reserve. I don't know how the storage. Because the museum, it's very it's a small part of all the collection. They used to invite artists to do that.
I address your question.
What do you think about this?
I think that's a wonderful question with a wonderful spectrum of answers. Let me perhaps start with the museum and the archive. If the museum models itself on an archive, I think in the case of the Stedelijk, it was interesting because what that presentation showed, I think, was how archives might organize their material in accordance to dates. And not style and no aesthetic experience, it's just dates, and you have that as an illustration of a certain moment in time. And I think there are very interesting examples of how museums, in particular, for example, anthropological museums, have in recent years structured their presentation in accordance to previous ways of narrating, of making sense of their collection, but doing that so that the construction of the narration becomes obvious, so that you look at the organizing principles for a moment. And I think in the Stedelijk it was for a moment.
And when you compare an archive to an art exhibition, usually the criteria for selection in an art exhibition are completely implicit, are not clear.
Yeah.
Whereas in the archive, it's completely clear.
And nevertheless, it's not neutral. It's never neutral, and I think the nice idea about modeling a museum on an archive is to expose exactly that and to show, look, there have been categories that we haven't talked about, but they're imminently always there. And what you said about the depot, but entering through the storage space, I think the Musée d'Orsay at the beginning was a little bit like that you actually had to go to the vaults and then actually climb up again as a kind of experience to make you feel you've entered almost a grave before you actually were enlightened by what else you saw. But I think exhibiting depots has become such a popular device. And if we look at it from a point of view of a museum modeling itself on an archive, I think what that does is it talks about possessions. And then you use the word treasure. So you talk about not what the things do, but you talk about who they belong to and what they should represent as possessions.
And how many you have, no? Yeah, Deborah.
And if I may add that in the case of La Biennale or Documenta or La Biennale de Lyon, keep in mind that we are not a museum. So we do not have a permanent collection. It's not part of our business. Yes, we have the historical fund, but some works that were collected in the past when artists used to live to the institution an artwork, but nowadays no one leave us for free any artworks. But it is not in our spirit, because, as I said, each exhibition is a research project. Is a research project of the curator. And in this research, it happens nowadays that a part starts from studying the archive, studying the past, what happened, but not as just to remember the past, but to keep it as something that is useful to project the future, in this precise moment. And I was thinking when you were talking that, for instance, also in the last Biennale of Lyon, one of the venue exhibition were in an abandoned the Natural Museum of the city, and it was a research project also in that case, and the curators started the exhibition from the archive, the basement of the archive, and so you started the visit, and then you go through the exhibition to the last level, but starting from the archive in a sort of research that starts in the past, but has to arrive to the present and maybe to the future.
Well, I can say something about that too. I was thinking about many things when you talked, and you gave this example. I was thinking about the audience, how it transforms the audience also to go into something that they feel that they can be protagonists, because they will discover things more than being shown clearly with the perfect lighting, everything. I think this is much more interesting in many situations. But I was also thinking about, basements, and me that more recently, and more because of this work I'm doing with African art, traditionally where you can find exotism is in the basement, so it's good and bad. It depends of what you want, because when it's dark, exotism and ghosts come and makes your heart beat, good or bad, but we know these feelings, So I was putting this into different levels. Good, because if it's not problematic, okay. If it's an act of racism, not so good.
See, very short, because what you said about the storage as a kind of treasure room, that's indeed very problematic. And then it's very much about ownership. See how much I have, I possess. But another metaphor you could use for the storage is Wunderkamer. Wunderkamer is, of course, also related to the possessions of princes and royal families and so on. But still, just the name Wunderkamer, that is about, in a way, the stimulation of certain questions, research. Although historically it was very different, still, I think it's a beautiful metaphor, Wunderkamer.
Me gustaría añadir una cosa.
I would like to add one thing here. When the basement of our collection is shown, or with the archive with 4 times more works of art than in the actual rooms of the permanent collection, there's also something that is lost, which is the assembly part of it all. I think that one of the main differences between working with an archive, consulting as a researcher, or interacting with it, and assembling or putting together an exhibition is the strength it has, the juxtaposition of one element next to the other one. This responds to formal questions or chronological questions in an exhibition applied very rigidly, and the exhibition develops lots of layers of meaning and significance that are one of the aspects that separate most the exhibition and the archive. The will that something is next to something else, and this generates a series of meanings that interact ones with the others. I don't know whether you see it this way, but for me, this decision of what you place what to or next to what, this in an archive you can't find it as clearly as in an exhibition. I have a question for Katarina. I have one more question, and maybe for you too as well. It's something very specific. I would like to know, or I was fascinated by the first images where you were showing the labels with which you classified that collection with African indigenous art, taking into account that these labels were placed there in order to make it more scientific and objective, and so as to not express any political opinion. And seeing them now, they represent something that is incredibly violent. You have done all these work to recognize, to identify, and recover the colonial history of the objects and the people who were part of that colonial whole. I don't know whether the museum has any plans on how to preserve that information from now on. What is going to happen when this artistic project is over? Well, that is a question for the director. She is here, and maybe she can answer much better than I can.
Buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. This is a problem. Well, my English is not too good, and my Spanish is not too good either. So let's see how we do this. This is a very interesting question that I ask myself a lot, and I often speak to Katarina about this. This is a collection that does not belong to the museum, and that for 40 years was in the storage room or depot. We knew nothing about it. We had the will of getting to know it better, but we didn't really know how to. As Katarina said, this is an antique art museum, decorative arts from the Renaissance and the Baroque, and we have no resources, human resources, to study or make the proper research. And with the work of Katarina, we didn't know how to continue, but we were following a very fruitful path. I believe that for the future, well, the museum is now closed because of ongoing works, and we are thinking about the entire formulation of the permanent exhibition, and these objects will obviously help us reflect on what the museum's exhibition will communicate to society.
And of course, all these objects will be decisive. They will play a key role in the shaping of future exhibitions. And I am sure the objects will contribute to bridging gaps. We want the museum to reflect the community where it is hosted, so the history of the objects, the specific and individual history of objects are part of the city, and of course the museum aims at reflecting such plural identity. So when we discussed through Zoom for the preparation of this symposium, the first thing you said was, oh, in Portugal you are far ahead where compared to Spain. And I was like, no, on the contrary. So as you have heard, well, you've heard the director of a unique museum in Portugal who is doing something that no one else is doing, which is opening the doors to researchers, to agents like myself. I'm not an anthropologist myself, so the director of this museum is open to new approaches, opening doors and windows, so that as many stakeholders as possible can, let's say, have a say. If you allow me, well, thank you very much. If I understood you correctly, you said that directors, museum directors, don't like artists. Well, we love artists. We really like artists and promoting mediation projects with artists stemming from contemporary art practices in order to redefine, resignificate objects and collections that date back from the first century or even from before. But again, we really care about resignifying and providing objects with new layers of signification. And I believe that in the last years, or a long time ago, we were a little bit afraid about artists because they are quite moody and they want to do things their way. But we like artists, right? So I believe the key element is to work in a co-creation logics, as it has been said many times today. It's all about opening a dialogue, digging into the stone, digging in, and yeah, this is key. I must say that artists today, or at least this is our experience, artists show a great deal of respect for the institution of museums. They do not impose their views. They really respect us. So yeah, I am very happy about our partnership with artists. Would you like Eric? Eric would like to say something. Please go ahead.
Um, I believe that the Sala Coloniale is much more than a collection of objects. Those objects were collected by people. They were shown and appreciated by all those students of the Liceo. So they are a colonizing monument within a society, within a community. And I would hope that in future, this colonizing aspect, or rather the decolonizing aspect, would be more on the forefront than the exact meaning of those objects. So who were the people who did this? And I think this is just one example. Everywhere in the world now, archives and museums are trying to decolonize their holdings, or at least the descriptions of their holdings, adding stories to objects which have been held in Dutch case since the 17th century, after we had ousted the Portuguese of all the profitable markets. But decolonizing is more than just changing a label. It necessitates, it entails, I think, also connecting with the descendants of the slaves and of the people who were the object of colonization. Is this something which is in museum terms acceptable, or do you say, well, we have just those objects, and what happened with the objects before they entered the museum is not our business? I would say the contrary. You have to bring forward the communities, the people, the merchants, the soldiers, the military, the politicians who were the source of this colonial expression.
Yes, go ahead. It's not easy in a country with, well, I'm not putting Portugal in exclusion, of course, but mainly what we saw here, it's a kind of knowledge. Colonial knowledge is knowledge. So how can you fight knowledge? It's difficult because you learn to learn in a certain way, no? So, because the books that are there, they are very important books. They're racist books, but they are important. They 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 are responsible for what we are today. Okay, so that's why we felt since the beginning with Alexandre that working with teenagers will unbalance this and create spaces to work, because teenagers, they are not specialists. They are not, but we were able to listen to what they said without their authority in case, in the table. No? They were touching these objects that just before they came into the room, they were like, put like if it was a treasure, and they take this like that, and it's okay. This is already something that you have to work with this, not to say anything. Okay, this is more important that they touch the object than, to preserve it, which is, for people that work in museums, a tough material, right? And of course, I didn't went through each detail of the project because it's very long and the film is almost finished, and it has in itself, in the montage, a sense, but there is this reflection about what do you put aside? Because we worked very much from where these objects came, who brought them, how was the appearance of this room. But then suddenly when it was the moment to deactivate, the way it was disincorporated was much more revealing of the normativity of the building. Because, okay, books are ours, but African, they are. Okay, so our knowledge, their knowledge already. So you could actually analyze this that way. And this is all over the project too. And what else can matter more to a museum today with the meaning of these policies behind catalogation, how they work into what is important, what is not. How are you going to decolonize something that is in your blood or is in DNA? So when we think about decolonization, we don't let our minds go through the word colonize or colonies, or we just think about authority and how this is also, you don't like this. Okay, I go on. Yes, we think about all this, and that's why we put no specialists talking about these subjects. Our specialists were the teenagers for once.
But I would say you fight knowledge with more knowledge, no? In a way, so you have to develop a new layer of knowledge that kind of gives a different light on the knowledge.
Well, there's something called unlearning too.
Yeah, also. Yeah. Laura, me interesa saber.
I would, Nora, because, well, in Italy, you share a complex past, like in Spain, with a fascist period. I know the case of some German archives that have started revisiting this part of their history, which had not been perhaps given enough public visibility. So the question is, the Biennale archive, is it going through a revision process of certain periods of the Italian history? Are you willing also to unlearn, as Caterina said, regarding the history of the Biennale, or has it not been done yet? Thank you.
No. The period of the fascism and the relationship with the fascism was part of one part of the exhibition, the discarded muses. And in a very fair, it was illustrated in a very fair version, because the point that the Biennale has always reacted with freedom in all the periods. And it was founded in a period where a part of the FASIM was improving new institutions, because in the late in 1895 born also the Triennale of Milan and the Quadriennale, because it was a vision of promoting the research and the arts. So this was the very first time. And also when in 1932 was inaugurated the film festival, which was the first international film festival in all over the world. It was an initiative that comes from a government that belongs to the FASIM. And this was a period, a good period for the activities. But then, when it crossed the nascent, and con il patto di ferro sostanzialmente, and then all was breakdown, of course. And also in the exhibition we show that the film festival at one moment were selected only Italian or German films, and so the international producers, the Americans and the Europeans, wanted a place where they can show all the films. And so in France they decided to have a Cannes. Cannes had to place in 1939, but then there was the war, and so they had to stop. But the decision to have another film festival was against the position of the Italian government that has the alliance with the German. But that was it's an international situation, not specific of our country. While in the first period they promoted the development of the activities, but there was no, and there is, I can remember, I cannot find any period when the activities of la Biennale try to remove and not to understand the current situation, the geopolitical situation. That was the basis of the exhibition, because it's something very, very specific and very, very interesting about the development of our activities. Because if you, for instance, in the early 60s, in the 68, the producers, and they say no film festival. They do not want it that the festival was inaugurated, and there were a lot of discussion with the artists in the Giardini. They say, oh, you have to stop with the prizes, with the competition. And it was a point of discussion. The Biennale was always a place where discussions were shown to the public, emerge in a good and a bad way. And so in that sort of way, it's a very interesting place to study.
¿Quieres añadir algo o no?
Would you like to add anything else? Okay, I would like to say that when Katerina told us about her project, I was, happy, because I believe that all the colonial task here in Spain is only at an early stage, whereas in Germany, it's part of the public debate, right? Restitution, the devolution of objects from important museums towards the African countries where they had been stolen from. Recently, the Humboldt Forum has been inaugurated with a, let's say, a sort of history of universal art with a very genuine and intense debate in the media also. It's not a debate among the specialists only. But I would like to ask you, Beatrice, when it comes to archives, is there any sort of initiative of this nature in Germany, or is it more a matter that affects objects collections?
I think I do not. I do not make such a big difference necessarily between museums and archives, because I understand them really as intertwined. And I think I appreciate very much the initiatives that understand the more ephemeral archival material as part of a larger, broader collection, and that the split for me doesn't really make so much sense. I'm more interested in the kind of integrative way of dealing with the different parts of the material that has once been collected. And I think that would perhaps also go hand in hand with what you just said about the Humboldt Forum and the anthropological museums. It's kind of interesting, at least that's how I have seen it so far, that the most experimental approaches within museums stemming from anthropological museums I have seen in the Netherlands. I find that there, and I don't think it's by chance, that two of the most innovative museum directors coming from the Netherlands and are now running German anthropological museums, and there they do not differentiate between the different parts of their collection. They're using it and they're producing new material, and they use it exactly as you just said, that you expose a unit as the epistemological strategy that was combined to it or connected to it. And I think I very much like these ways of dealing with collected material in a variety of ways, and not as something that you then have as a permanent installation, but rather as something that's on the move and puts a new material in and out and produces new material through research and through experience that happens within the exhibition and so on.
Jorge, please go ahead. Can you hear me? Loud and clear. I have a concern since this morning, which is that this morning we have been speaking about archiving and exhibiting, right? And now we are also raising comments about the basements, the collections that are stuck in basements, and also about the colonial room in Portugal, which is a very rare case. But yet we are showing scenographies of exhibitions full with archives, when in fact archives have a long list of codes in order to be exhibited, so to speak. And perhaps it's not exploited. I mean, all the possibilities that archives give us are not exploited. We're not making the most of the potential that archives hold. We speak more about scenographies than about other archivistic codes exhibited. I hope I made myself clear.
¿Queréis decir algo al respecto?
Would you like to comment? I would like to comment, but what about you? I give you the honor to start. Well, I know my teacher very well, and indeed, this has had an impact on many of us. This is an easy criticism, so to speak. Sometimes an artist reinterprets, I think I'm speaking Portuñol here, well, reinterprets an archive, right? when there is a reinterpretation about an archive from an artist, there is some sort of obsession about extracting a certain value that is, let's say, withheld by the archive from a certain perspective. And I always recall, I work often with Mozambique and other geographies where it is not always possible to speak one's mind out loud. So there, in Mozambique, archives are not very much welcome because, of course, in archives we reveal and we denounce, but there are archives also in Mozambique. And of course, there's gossip going on about what's going on in the archives. So I'm not sure you were referring to this. I don't think you were referring to this. But when you say how to exhibit an archive, we need to think first about what archive, what kind of archive are we thinking about? Are we thinking about a, well, I mean, I could give you a long list of archives that are label-less, that have no labels, no stamps. So if I were to exhibit an archive with no labels at all, many people probably would say, what's the point then of exhibiting it beyond naming and shaming? An archive that has no labels. I know my answer is quite radical and out of the box. I'm just trying to share here a little bit of a controversial perspective. I believe it's been attempted in terms of books exhibition. While listening to your presentation, I was telling myself, well, I will switch into another topic if you agree, but maybe it's a relevant one. In biennales, one works on the exhibition and on the catalog. Oftentimes, both things go in parallel, and there's an hyper awareness about the material understood as an historic material, right? Because a selection will mark a generation of artists or interior designers. So it's like an historical chapter that is about to be built. And I wanted to ask you if, when one is in the process of rethinking about a Biennale archive, I mean, in this process, the catalog, is it reinterpreted? Do you elaborate a catalog of the catalog? So, what is the thinking about this second form of production?
Um, you're talking about the catalog of the exhibition, how it develops, because in fact it's a problem, the catalogs of our exhibition, because we are trying to have a catalog that reproduce the exhibition, because more works happens in as a site specific, so we try to have the memory of the real exhibition, not the catalog. So catalog as volumes. It's a byproduct. Yes, yes, and we try to do that. And this is a specific task of the archive, because one question is how you document nowadays the exhibition, what has to remain from the exhibition, so not only the catalog, of course. And so we try to have different way of representing the exhibition, not only through a catalog, through a volume, through papers. And we have a specific program for the documentation that we run with the curator, of course, trying to use all the technologies that we are at disposal to reproduce of course, not only a video of the exhibition, but a type of video that represents and can give also the relationship that each curator wants to have with the public. You know, trying to have the specific experience that a visitor has when he had the visit at the exhibition, because that is part it's the core of the visit of the exhibition. It's not only the specific art craft or the specific participation, but it's the whole experience. And so we try to have a video recordings, also with talking with the artist, having an interviews with the artist, participating, that they can try to explain the meaning of their participation. And so having a sort of a lot of contribution that has it's a new type of catalog.
Okay.
Because on the other case it would be yes, of course, the traditional catalog that the public still wants to have, but it's not what we want to leave to the future. That the exhibition changes into an historical document in that sort of documentation.
Bueno, me parece que vamos.
Well, we have to close it. Actually, we're running 4 minutes late, but I would like to reply to Jorge. Jorge, I agree with you. We are in a museum context, and the debate is about exhibiting and archiving, so most of us look at archives from a museistic perspective, okay. But what I was thinking while you asked your question is that archives have their own rituals and systems of representations. White gloves, access conditions that force you to leave your stuff in a closed room before accessing an archive. You know, it's a fact. In many archives, you are not allowed in without white gloves on. We have all gone through this performance, and of course, it has an impact on the user experience, on the user experience. So probably the thing goes down this line. When I think about archives and I differentiate them from museums, I believe it would be interesting to know if there are archives which are in the process of rethinking their categorization processes. Like this morning, it has been said, developing a framework which has nothing to do with a traditional framework. Up to date, there have been very few examples. I understand that the debate is precisely about this point, but there are archives beyond art where we also face these sort of problems. There's another question. The question comes from the internet viewers. What does classifying exhibitions mean, and what different points of view can we take? Would you like to offer a short answer to the question? I hope you got it because it came in very fast.
It's a question for you, I think.
No, I try to. The answer is more or less the same I gave help before. Of course, we have to find new ways of cataloging and archiving the exhibition. It's not only the traditional with the documents, but it's using the new technologies and the opportunities that new technologies give us. So, video recordings, interviews with the artists, keeping the memory of the artists participating. But if I may add, just to close, the way of improving the research and the use of archive is open the archive to everyone. Make it available as a platform for research. And so from different point of view, students, researchers, curators, we can find other ways of implementing and evaluating the materials. And not only one solution, there are more than one solution from different point of view, but we have to make it a disposal of the users, not closed with the white clothes and as in the past.
No sé si queréis añadir algo a la pregunta online, quizás.
would you like to comment on the question about what does it mean to archive exhibitions?
Yeah, I think the classification, I understood your question really much more in relation to what happens if there's a new director of a biennial with a very different idea of what an exhibition should be, and suddenly looks at the archival catalogue and says, this has to be reorganized. And I think that would be lovely. Every second year, somebody reorganizes the archival catalogue. And I think then the whole question of what a classification of an exhibition might be would become extremely mobile, dynamic, and I know you get lost. But that's sometimes the case in archives with a very strict organizing principle as well. But I would like that. I would like to see different layers of a reinterpretation.
Like biennial, but it's 2 years, so you have it.
The biennial would be a lot.
To redo the archive.
Yeah. No, but sometimes you can't find things because the reorganizing system or the organizing system is so different from your own way of associating material. And it would be nice if you could reflect on that. It would bring us again back to the question of what entities allow a certain kind of knowledge, and how can you reorganize an entity so to make, in order to make that a principle visible and usable, reusable in a different way.
Yes, but if I may add, but keep in mind that as a curator, you have to maintain the relationship with the visitor. So also the visitor needs something. So you have to offer something that is a guide for the visitor. Then you have also the other documentation of research. But as the catalog, so-called catalog point of view, it has also a function for the visitor, and you have to keep that because the visitor is our first user. In any case, you can avoid, but also the curator asks for that.
No, I see that, and I agree entirely. There need to be guidelines, but these guidelines should perhaps be exposed in their own conditioning, because I mean they're not neutral. They're not given. They're not the same for every museum or for every archive and so on. So I think even if you have professional archivists, I don't know. I'm not, but nevertheless, I think it makes a lot of sense to actually expose what the preconditions of this ordering system might have been, and what you're using as a guide to address the visitors. And that's, I think, is the same for museums as well.
For the exhibition, it's different because it's very linked to the project, to the research, and so it's different. Each time is different. And that is very linked and in the autonomy of each curator. It has to be free to expose his own research. We cannot give a guide to it. Also, when he used archive elements.
Bueno,
I don't know.
Go ahead. Yes.
Just very quickly, the reason why I can't really articulate an answer to this provocation is because in listening to you, so doing the opposite, thinking about this and deliver solutions, it's maybe that because me as many artists don't like to give solutions.
You like to give, you like to give problems.
We prefer the problem.
Sí, me parece que sobre esto vamos a hablar más mañana porque tendremos.
We are going to be speaking about this point tomorrow. There will be presentations from the artist's perspective, which will for sure accessorize what we have been discussing about. See you tomorrow at Menac. We'll keep discussing tomorrow at Menac as of 9:30. Up in the mountain, up in the cliff of Montjuic. Thank you and see you tomorrow.